Good afternoon. This is my biggest Zoom screen since 2020. Pretty happy about it. I've been doing RSA a long time. How many of you went to RSA when it was in San Jose? How many of you went to RSA when it was at the Sofitel in Redwood City? No, I guess I'm the only one then. So I've been doing this a long time, and I have a very unusual background for a very unusual topic, and I want you to know that I know how detailed you guys are, so I prepared a very detailed script, but as RSA goes, this is kind of a small audience, and I think I might disregard every rule for RSA speakers, and I know we're supposed to take questions at the end, okay? But I'm going to pause several times in the middle to take questions because this is a very unusual topic, and unfortunately, the law of armed conflict, or as it's sometimes called, international humanitarian law, can be at the very high level, and when we look at cyber war, it can be in the technical weeds, okay? So there is this balance, and I'm going to try and walk the line. So I've had the opportunity to attend several sessions about the Ukraine here, and so I updated my materials, not the slides, because for those of you, how many of you have ever been a speaker here? Okay, so you guys know that you have to have your slides in way ahead of time, then the program committee gives you helpful hints, and they have to approve your final version, okay? So you don't have a lot of flexibility on the slides, but I do on the narrative. So in terms of war crimes, the Washington Post reported in January that there were 25 Russian soldiers convicted of war crimes in the Ukraine. And they were doing really bad things. They beat and tortured soldiers, they shelled residential buildings. And the article went on to say that the Ukraine alleged over 60,000 individual war crimes as a result of the Russian invasion. Now, one of the things I'm going to do today is I'm going to help you understand the difference between a war crime, genocide, and crimes against humanity. I'm going to help you understand that. And we're going to go where no RSA attendee has ever gone before, and that is we're going to apply the traditional international humanitarian law in the cyber realm, something that doesn't really exist today. I've also have several incidents that are actual incidents, and then I have a couple of hypotheticals that we can discuss. Okay, having said that, I'm an attorney, but I didn't write this one. This is the RSA disclaimer. And oh, by the way, since I am an attorney, I'm obligated to say none of you are my clients, and I'm not giving legal advice. So if you're a war criminal in the audience expecting free legal advice, frankly, you're out of luck, okay? So let's move on to some of the substance of the material. So what is a war crime? They're all over the headlines. Well, according to my good friends in New York, who would know about war crimes in New York? I'll give you a hint. They have a funny-looking building in Midtown Manhattan. The UN. Good job. War crimes are violations of international humanitarian law, treaties, or customary laws. And there would be grave breaches of the 1949 Geneva Conventions and or serious violations of the laws of armed conflict. Now, is there anybody in his right mind that has a clue as to what that means? No. So the first takeaway is that much of the international humanitarian law is kind of squishy, okay? As with all kinds of criminal law, you have to have an act and an intent. The treaties, particularly the Rome Treaty, the Geneva Convention treaties, are very good at spelling out what acts are prohibited, and I'll cover some of those today. The other thing that's important to know is that international humanitarian law is triggered only when there's a conflict. And it can be triggered by two kinds of conflict: international, such as Ukraine-Russia, or conflict inside a state where there are warring factions, whether they're state actors or non-state actors. And their war crimes are characterized by being perpetrated against both combatants and non-combatants. The term combatant means someone who is actually considered a war fighter, and as I like to say with my military hat, they're a good target. So we have combatants, non-combatants. I like to say good target, bad target, okay? Makes a lot of sense. So the notion of war crimes in a cyber context conjures up a number of questions, and we're going to go over some of these. Who can be charged with a war crime? Who is considered a cyber combatant? Where would that defendant be prosecuted? Who has jurisdiction over the person, subject, and the subject matter, personal and subject matter? Are there any specific cyber war criminal laws? And have we ever seen a cyber war crime conviction? These are questions we're going to talk about today. So the first thing, the International Criminal Court is located in The Hague, and it was created by the Rome Statute in the late 40s. It is the world's first permanent international criminal court and prosecutes those accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And there have been several iterations of the International Criminal Court and various tribunals. I had the opportunity to spend a semester abroad in Bosnia from July 97 to February 98 as a part of the NATO Stabilization Force. I was the deputy commander of, this is a great acronym for those of you who are collectors, one you haven't heard yet. I guarantee you have not heard this acronym at this show. SIGJICTIV, Combined Joint Information Campaign Task Force, the PSYOP Task Force. So we came into contact with the International Criminal Trial for Yugoslavia because part of what the military force was supposed to do, and we did, was to apprehend, another good acronym, a PIFWIC, person indicted for war crimes, okay? So the International Criminal Court, considered to be the premier spot. Has there ever been a prosecution for a cyber war crime? Has anybody ever seen a prosecution for a cyber war crime? Well, that's the right answer. No, we haven't seen that yet. I'm moving a little slow because I have a checklist and I don't want to mess up on it. So the first thing I'm going to chat about is what is genocide. And genocide is the mental intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, and it requires extensive physical elements such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole and in part. And here's a good one, we'll need this one for later: forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We have seen in the headlines where Russia has removed children from the Ukraine and brought them across the border into Russian territory. That is considered an element of a genocidal crime according to international law. So I'm just going to stop for a half a second here, and I'm going to inject a hypothetical at this point, because you guys were nice enough to show up, and a lot of this is legal stuff I have to read word for word because that's the definition. So let's suppose, for argument's sake, there's a nice, well-known nonprofit group that runs summer camps for children. Let's call it Pals of Putin. Pals of Putin. Everybody knows who Putin is, right? Okay. So Pals of Putin takes children between the ages of 5 and 12 out of country A and brings them into their own country without the parents' permission. All right? Everybody with me so far? Okay? So let's say we have two people from that camp, the manager of the camp and the systems administrator / tech support person. Okay? How many people think the manager of the camp is a potential defendant? Manager of the camp, runs the operation, liaison to the government. Probably a good guess. How many people think that system administrator is a good defendant? Well, not as many. And the classic lawyer answer, of course, is it depends. But the technical definition is if an individual participates, facilitates, supports the crime, then they too can be a defendant. So in the cyber world, we could say that the IT administrator / tech support guy is a potential war criminal, but it's a cyber role, okay? I realize it's a bit of a reach for war crimes. And crimes against humanity is a very similar higher level crime. And the crimes against humanity, systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack, including murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, persecution on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, or other grounds. Apartheid, arbitrary imprisonment, yada, yada, yada. So, is it possible in your mind that cyber acts could contribute, can rise to the level of those two major high-level crimes, war crimes? It's possible. And I think when we go over the case studies, one of the questions that I'll be raising about the case studies is how can we change the facts, which the facts will change in the future, that would constitute a war crime. So, over the last couple of days, I've had, as I said, the good fortune to attend a couple of presentations on Ukraine. And here's what I've learned on the cyber war. One, cyber attacks are combined with other kinds of attacks. In the military, we have two kinds of attacks, kinetic and non-kinetic. Kinetic means things that blow stuff up, okay? Non-kinetic means my personal favorite, psychological warfare, cyber operations, electronic warfare. They won't tell you this, but public affairs can be a non-kinetic attack. Things that impact the battle space, but do not blow up or kill people or fight or have bullets. So in traditional land warfare, before an invasion, how many people have seen the movie Normandy? Okay, so there are all kinds of ships, artillery, softening up the beaches. Well, one could argue that a cyber attack against the infrastructure of the target country is the artillery attack of the 21st century because the cyber attack prepares the country for the ongoing invasion force. The cyber attacks are aimed at what we're going to talk about in a little bit, dual-use targets. So I said good target, bad target. If I have a tank, how many people think tank is a good target? Tank is a good target. Then we have another kind of target that's a dual-use target. Let's pick a school bus. School bus with junior high kids on it. As much as we hate them, they're not a good target. I mean, there's a lot of hormones, they're just not easy to deal with. There's a lot of dirty laundry, but you can't blow them up, okay? Bad target. If the school bus is filled with armed fighters with weapons, that school bus is now a good target, okay? So the school bus is a good example of dual use. In the case of cyber attacks, dual use against an infrastructure. I have the good fortune and pleasure to teach for a number of online law schools, including American Military University, where I teach cyber war. And one of the exercises is, you are an attacker, what are you going to attack? Well, out of 100 students, 95 of them say the power grid. We're going to do the power grid first. Power grid first, okay? So the power grid, like water supplies, dual use. Is that a good target? Depends. Another attorney in the group. That's correct. Depends is right. And I have a couple of examples that we can talk about. The other thing I learned about cyber war is that there are some cyber weapons that are not precise. NotPetya was cited as a good example of something that can go wrong, go wrong, go wrong, okay? Collateral damage, big factor in international humanitarian law. Also, in addition to the cyber operations prelude to the kinetic operations, there will be disinformation and malinformation. Now, unfortunately, at this highly sophisticated conference, people have been using those two terms synonymously. They are not synonyms. Disinformation is information that's plain-ass wrong. Now, I'm sure you have had debates with friends, neighbors, colleagues, relatives, where they were just plain wrong. They just didn't know. So that's disinformation. When I know the information is wrong, that's malinformation. Two different kinds of information. And so the kinetic attack is accompanied, preceded, and followed by a malinformation attack, which can include, among other things, social media, propaganda, as well as perhaps attacks using the state TV of the attacking nation. Many of the countries that are adversarial control the state media, radio, TV, newspaper. Okay. The other thing that's clear is that our good friend Vlad Putin, the guy that runs the summer camp I talked about before, is using the Ukraine as a test bed. And I believe it was the Ukrainian National Security Service guy yesterday who said that, in his opinion, the Russians were hoping for a very quick victory. He used the German term blitzkrieg, which I thought was kind of interesting, and used their better electronic cyber weapons up front. Don't know if that's the case. But clearly, China, Iran, my good friend Kim Jong-un, a lot of countries, U.S., are watching what's happening in Ukraine. Okay. Now, to determine when cyber attacks violate the law of armed conflict, humanitarian law, you have to know where this stuff comes from. So international humanitarian law comes from treaties. We talked about the Geneva Treaty. I also mentioned the Rome Treaty, customary rules of international law, and general principle of law, which are defined as legal norms followed by most nations. Now, I myself as an attorney would not want to take that one to the bank because who knows what most nations mean. There's also a school of thought that says the law of armed conflict can come from scholarly writings. Now, as it turns out, in the computer space, we do have a scholarly writing. It's called the Talonen Manual. The Talonen Manual. Does anybody know why it's called the Tallinn Manual? Go ahead, sir.
It was written in Tallinn.
Attaboy. And we know it was written at the request of NATO, right? Because their center of cyber excellence is there in Tallinn, Estonia, which is interesting because if you are a student of cyber war, why is Estonia interesting? They were one of the early targets. If you might remember, there was a statute of, I think it was Joe Stalin, that was pulled down by the Estonians, and the Russians didn't like that, so they did a cyber attack against Estonia. Okay. So, if you are interested in the principles of law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, I think the best source of information is the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICCR.org, International Committee of the Red Cross. They have a tremendous amount of material. I had the good pleasure of teaching an elective for Monterey College of Law on international humanitarian law, and I was able to use some good material from my good friends there in Switzerland. Okay, to trigger international humanitarian law, you have to have a conflict, and there have to be armed groups. And as you might expect, my brothers and sisters of the law have definition of an armed group. Carry weapons openly and visibly, which could mean Texans, right? Clear identification, not necessarily a uniform, and some sort of hierarchy. So part of the reason for that broader definition is so that a conflict inside a nation could trigger international humanitarian law. Let's pick some country at random, Sudan. Okay, there we have two very well-armed militarized functions inside the same country. So if only international conflicts triggered the international humanitarian law, then that wouldn't be triggered. But in this case, clearly it is. So there has to be a conflict. And so another part of this equation is on the next page here. So there's a difference between war and conflict. So war is a political declaration, and I'll make the statement that only nation states, recognized nation states, can declare war. So let's pick an example out of the sky. Let's suppose the West Bank wanted to declare war on Israel. They couldn't declare war because they're not a country, okay? But there could be an armed conflict. Armed conflicts have to have a minimum level of intensity, and intensity is determined by the number, duration, and gravity of the armed confrontations, doesn't have to necessarily be a clash, and clashes, the sum of where armed people are facing armed people. The number of people in units, the type of government involvement, and weapons, the kind of weapons. If I have automatic weapons involved, that's a big deal. If I have guys with just pistols and rifles, kind of depends on the facts. It also depends, the violence, the intensity also depends on the number of victims, the extent of property damage, and other impacts on the population. So for example, let's suppose as a byproduct of the war, there was a nuclear reactor in the middle. And let's suppose, for argument's sake, that instead of bombing their own city, one of the enemy forces bombed the nuclear reactor. And there was maybe not direct injuries, but a large chunk of the population around that nuclear reactor was displaced. Okay? All right. These are the four fundamental principles of international humanitarian law: distinction, proportionality, limiting of unnecessary suffering, and military necessity. And in analyzing whether international humanitarian law has been violated, these principles can be taken individually or together. So we'll start with distinction, I hope. There we go. Combatants, non-combatants. Now, one of the interesting parts of that is that we have proxies and contractors on the battlefield. We've all heard of the Wagner Group, and in the sessions I've gone to about the Ukraine, it seems that there have been organizations on both sides that were considered proxies. In theory, a number of those supporting the Ukraine and the Western perspective are hacktivists and are independent actors. Whereas it's claimed that the proxies supporting Russia are actually paid for by the state. They are cyber criminals who have been hired by the Russian government, okay? In the case of international humanitarian law, if you are part of a nation state, then you might be hit with international criminal law. If you are just a dirtbag individual or a proxy, you would be treated in all probability by criminal law because of the nature of your war crimes that are against individuals. Okay. The next one is also important in terms of IT, particularly our example of the power grid, and that is proportionality. So if I have an attack on a power grid that knocks out the city of San Francisco, when there was actually only a minor military force on Alcatraz, that would clearly be disproportional. So one of the things that you have to look at when you have dual use in infrastructure, power, heating, water, banking, is the proportion. I often say it's the rowboat attack in the battleship. What sort of military force do I need to accomplish my military result? And is the target a military target? The principle of distinction, military target. If you're interested in learning about international humanitarian law, the Red Cross provides free classes on international humanitarian law. There's a 1-hour version, there's a 3-hour version, there's an 8-hour version. And there is quite a bit of emphasis on proportionality. So one example is I have an apartment building, and I have one bad guy on the 15th floor. If I bring in the fighter jets and blow up the building, I think everybody would argue that's pretty much out of proportion. Contrast if I have a small 2-story building that's being used by a major headquarters that has 20 or 30 generals and admirals in it, and maybe 2-3 civilian contractors. I brought in the fighter jets to blow that puppy up. I think most people would say good target. So the amount of damage from the attack, the collateral damage, has got to be in relation to the military necessity and the proportionality. Okay. Limiting unnecessary suffering. This is a hard one, frankly, for me to relate to the cyber side. When I teach the regular course, I teach about fungible bullets and landmines, weapons that are indiscriminate. So if we couple military necessity, which is my next block, let's just jump into that. If I couple military necessity with unnecessary suffering and I knock out the water supply to a major city when there's just a small garrison, I think everybody would agree that's not a good target. If we put it in the other box, this also says that measures that are not prohibited are justified to secure total submission of the enemy. What this one is basically saying is that espionage, propaganda, psychological operations, malinformation, disinformation, those are all legitimate means of war that can be used for that military force to gain a victory. Okay, it's a general principle of law that the law trails the technology, and cyber war is no exception. There's no real international authority on cyber war, and there may or may not be an agreed upon definition. Here's one I got from the RAND organization. But even this one doesn't include non-state actors or proxies, but it's as good a definition as any. And in terms of the challenges to cyber war, self-defense is considered the right of nations and individuals. When self-defense may be justified if an armed attack is instant, overwhelming, leaves no choice or other means, and there is no time for deliberation. So, does this mean that the kind of attack that was launched against the Ukraine prior to the invasion using the Wiper software would have been justification in the international eyes for Ukraine to shoot electrons back? Who thinks yes? Probably so, because it was pretty debilitating. Whereas if we have a situation where self-defense is not justified, such as cyber espionage, theft of intellectual property, and cyber interruptions of non-essential services. So a cyber attack on the Internal Revenue Service here in America would probably be greeted with cheers as opposed to, let's try those Russian dirtbags, right? So the cyber aspects of it are not as hard to put in context as some of the other areas. The key here is attribution, another element that I didn't put on the slide, and that is attribution. Can you clearly identify the attacker as being from a hostile force? The Soviet Union is an example. We talked about that. I'm not going to cover that again. Nation states are concerned about uses of force as a violation of international law, but I think it's fair to say not every nation state gives a poop about international law. My good friend, Mr. Putin, being a good example of somebody who does not. So, in terms of cyber particular issues, how do we know if someone is in the cyber armed force? How do we know? Is the person who develops the malware culpable as the person who uses it? And if an attacker is using malware they bought, is that producer of that malware liable as an accomplice? Well, nobody has settled any of these questions, although if, for the moment, let's assume that How many of you have heard of Pegasus, the software company, and the software company behind it in Israel? Let's assume for the moment that Pegasus is deployed by a commercial entity in the United States. If they're not liable for criminal act, what are they liable for? Potentially. Civil litigation. My brothers and sister litigators need to make a living, right? So if there is no criminal action, is there a potential for a civil action? And in the cyber world, that's hard because you have to get jurisdiction over somebody who's an adversary. Not a good idea. Okay. I'm going to jump into the case studies, but before I do, does anybody have any questions they'd like to raise at this point? Yes, ma'am. You want to go up to the microphone? It's right there. Hope it's easy.
So if a person picks up a weapon and
Yeah.
starts firing at the enemy, even
Right.
though they're a civilian, they're now a combatant, right?
Yes, ma'am.
If a person sees a radio person who's calling in enemy positions get killed, and they start using their phone to do the same thing, have
Good
they
target.
now become a combatant?
Good target. Shoot.
So General Clark was bragging about how every person in Ukraine has a phone in their pocket and is
Well,
doing
every
this,
person,
so-
what I think that guy was saying in the panel, or the gal, whoever said it, was that they're intelligence reporters. And they're saying the Russian tanks are over here by the gas station. Here's a picture. The metadata on the phone, target data, whoomp. That person who's provided the intelligence, probably not a good target. I'd defend them. I'd take that one. Uh-oh, guy with a laptop. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. A fantastic talk so far, I guess. In the case of Pegasus, right, VNSO Group, if they were to be held liable, like you said, right?
Information,
Would that be
invasion of
because-
privacy is what I had in mind.
Right. Is it because the weapon is, unlike, say, an AK-47 or something like this, it is meant to inflict, there are some weapons that are not okay, like, landmines specifically designed to
Well,
attract children and that kind of thing, right?
Landmines are an indirect weapon, kind of like a shotgun blast. They don't care who they blow up.
Right.
That's why they're frowned upon by international conventions. I picked Pegasus because invasion of privacy is a good civil lawsuit. That's the reason I picked that one. So you have to, when you're an attorney, you have to look at what's the recovery the client wants. So in the case of international humanitarian law, when I have somebody accused of war crimes, we want that dirtbag to go to jail, or we want them killed. I mean, it depends on how serious it is, right? So we had the Nuremberg trials, right? That's certainly not cyber, right? So in the case of individuals, you look at what was the weapon or the technology used for. And so I was saying you wanted to punish the perpetrator, in this case a commercial entity, which is a good defendant, they have money, and you want to do that through civil litigation. So that's kind of off the topic of war crimes and cyber, but the point is there has been no cyber war crime conviction, to my knowledge. And we have, I think, among us agreed upon the nature of a participant in a cyber war crime, which the legal system may not have. Yes, sir.
So is Uncle Vlad likely to care? First of all, what are the odds of him being convicted of anything ever? And is he likely to care? Will that have any impact, or can he just...
Okay, so that was, as we say in the law biz, about 3 questions, okay? The first question was, is he going to care? Well, probably not. Is he going to get convicted? You know, by 2023 standards, I would say no. However, in 2030, maybe by that time, oligarchs 1 through 9 will have accumulated enough money and enough power that it'll be like an old movie where, Vlad, the time has come. You are no longer a good soldier. You know, and he's out the door. But it's like, for those of you who are historians, you remember the I Love You virus? The guy who wrote it was in the Philippines, remember? And the Philippines did not have any computer crime statutes at the time. Okay? All right, well, let's take these imaginative thoughts and let's apply them to some of these cases that I've found. And here's the questions we're looking at. Does the situation trigger the law of armed conflict? Was there a violation? If so, what principle? But the one on the bottom is the one I want you to pay attention to the most. FWAT, that's a new word. You're going to see that on the show floor along with XDR, FWAT. Okay, it's a new acronym. What escalation would be necessary to make this a cyber war crime? Okay, so let's look at the first one. So the first one, for those of you who do not want to read every word, I will explain that this is a North Korean attack on a number of hospitals in America. North Korean attack, number of hospitals in America. How many people think this is a violation of international humanitarian law? Cannot possibly be, there's no conflict. Trick question, we call that law school, okay? There's condition preceding, you have to have a conflict. Yes, ma'am?
Not armed conflict, but what about norms?
Norms? Mere violation of a norm absent a conflict does not trigger international humanitarian law. No legal advice, war criminal, okay? That was pretty straightforward. But let's suppose, for argument's sake, there was this attack and people died as a result. Let's say there were some patients who were not able to get the services or whatever they needed, and so there were a dozen patients who died. Does that change your picture? No conflict. Is 10 people dead a conflict? No. Yes, sir.
Isn't that some form of terrorism, though?
Could be terrorism, makes it a regular crime. So then I'd have to get personal jurisdiction over Kim Jong-un, which is not likely to happen. So, not happening. All right, let's move on to the next one. The Bulgarian government, the Bulgarian presidency, and several other ministries were attacked. Let's suppose for a moment that it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the attackers were from the Russian GRU, which, for those of you who don't follow my good friend Vlad, the GRU is the military branch, not to be confused with the FSB, which is the descendant of the KGB, pardon the acronyms. Would that attack be a violation of the law of armed conflict? Major ministries paralyzed, Defense Department paralyzed. Could this be justification for a counterattack? Yes, it could be a justification for a counterattack. I'm sorry? Yeah, well, yeah, could. So, Bulgaria, interesting one. How am I doing? How am I doing on time? 5 minutes, oh, poop. I'm going to skip on. Where'd I go? Okay, let's suppose we have Russian cyber attacks against Poland, okay? Let's suppose that we have several defectors from Russia who say, this is all part of an organized plan to overthrow the government, destabilize the government of Poland. And as a result of that, there were a number of energy facilities that were not available. What do we think? War crime? Who says yes? Who says, I don't know, but I'd shoot back? Yeah, this is a big deal, trying to destabilize the government, okay? I think that's the last. But I made up a couple of cases for fun. Okay, there is a company called KHUZESTAN, Kazakhstan Steel Company. It is one of the world's top 10 steel producers. It just so happens to be located in Iran. For some mysterious reasons, they were hacked and all their production stopped. War crime? Annoyance? Who cares? It's Iran. Right? A Chinese hacker group, Moshan Dragon, targets Asian telecoms. It deploys Impact, a Python kit, that enables remote access. Several cities report major outages of telecom services. Are those countries where the cities are in entitled to shoot back? Maybe. Not enough, I don't think. Okay, how much time do I have? 4 minutes. Okay. Anybody got any questions? Now, because you have to do what they tell you in the program committee, you have to have a next steps slide, okay? The takeaway I'd like to leave you with, and I'll take this gentleman's question first. Go ahead, sir.
So, there's two types of attacks, right? A kinetic attack and a non-kinetic attack.
That is correct.
So, from the looks of it, for the most part, hacking, infiltration, dealing with disabling computer systems are not kinetic.
That is correct. They don't blow things up so far.
What happens if they happen to do something that does cause something to blow up indirectly, like shutting down a cooling system, for instance?
Or a nuclear reactor in Iran.
Right. I mean, that does become kinetic.
That is a
point, doesn't it?
kinetic act, in my opinion.
So it would be considered a war crime. Or not a war crime, but a kinetic attack.
That is, I think it's a kinetic attack. Absolutely, it had physical effect. Okay, on an alleged dual-use target.
Yep. Right. So they would have the right to shoot back.
Well, nobody has really claimed attribution.
Okay. So it could be considered a kinetic act if it does.
There
cause
was
some
a
sort of-
physical result.
Gotcha.
The centrifuges got screwed up, got destroyed. Yes, sir.
Is it possible to say anything about the level of proof needed to actually attribute who is the source of an attack?
Well, I did state that you need to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt of the source. Reasonable doubt being the criminal standard. So in terms of takeaways, first thing is be involved, be sensitive to what's going on. Be aware of what's going on. 2, take a free course on international humanitarian law from the Red Cross. Or if you have a bossy wife like I have, who's a 40-plus year volunteer to Red Cross, become an instructor like we are. We team teach those courses. And if you want to just learn about it, there are some references there, the best one being the International Committee of the Red Cross. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes back of your day. Thank you very much.